There is nothing supernatural.
You knew my husband a long time.
Oh, yes, madame.
And you remember what he always said about these things?
That it was impossible for the dead to return.
This proves he was right. For if it would have been possible, I would have had some sign from him in the past 10 years.
The latest invention, the water cell. Although there is nothing supernatural about it, supernatural. There is nothing supernatural about it.
That it was impossible for the dead to return.
This proves he was right. For if it would have been possible, I would have had some sign from him in the past 10 years.
The female voice you just heard is that of Bess Houdini, wife and stage assistant to her husband, Harry. She's discussing his fascination with death and his belief that the dead could return. She would learn that in fact the dead don't come back. An immigrant, a hustler, a believer in good things, a cheater and a showman. Do you believe in magic? I do, but I've got my limits. But what about the people who believe there are no limits? Magic could take them to places no human had ever been. And what about the fakers, the pretenders who just make it up and try to fool the world? Well, my friends, as Marco Tempest the magician says, magicians will always tell you the trick is the most important thing. But I'm more interested in the story they're telling. Welcome to Extraordinary Stories Podcast. Hey, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. So, it's been a while. What have you been up to? What have you been doing with your time? I suppose I should kind of explain maybe just briefly where I've been. So, basically, I've been in a conservatorship. Because basically the podcast got so famous, I got so famous from the podcast that basically for my own safety, I was locked away and not allowed to communicate with the public. You might have seen it on the news. There was a whole big free Barry campaign. There was a huge amount of, hang on a minute. Was that me or was that Britney Spears? Shit, I forever get us mixed up. I always do that. I wake up some mornings and I think, hang on, am I the hit singer of Oops, I Did It Again? Or was that... But I always get us mixed up. Okay, I've introduced roughly what the episode's about. And yeah, it's about magic. You know, look, believer, non-believer, fan, not a fan, I think the story I've picked is really a brilliant magician's story. So, as the magician said to the assistant, get the rabbit ready. We're going to amaze people. I don't know if he did. Okay, let's go. It's pretty amazing that by the end of his life, Harry Houdini would be called the man who made the impossible possible. That is quite the claim to fame. So how did this all begin? Where did it all start for Harry? Well, it didn't start as Harry Houdini, because that's not his name. His name is Eric Weiss. Now, depending on what you read and what sources you look at, you'll get a different idea of his childhood home. The truth is, Eric Weiss was born in Hungary, Budapest to be exact. An amazing city. If anyone ever offers you the opportunity to go to Budapest, don't even think about it, just say yes, I'll be there. Now, quickly after his birth, his parents moved to the USA. So he wasn't born in the USA like Bruce Springsteen. He was in fact born in Hungary, and a lot of historical data there gets kind of mixed up, and people will say, oh, although he came from Hungarian parents, he was actually born in America. He wasn't. So his mother and his father, who was a rabbi, they were both Hungarian, and the Weiss family was big. Eric was one of 7 children. 7 children. Those crazy Hungarians, am I right? Do you know what? I don't actually know if I am right. Do Hungarians have big families? I don't know. I don't actually know what I'm talking about. So when Eric was young, his family moved to Wisconsin, where his dad could get a job as a local rabbi. From a really young age, Eric was athletic and nimble. He was always up some trees, balancing on some fences. He spent a large amount of his day running. He would do like cross country running. He was just this kind of like athletic, tumbling kind of child who was always climbing up something, or, you know, that kind of idea. Now, as a child, he was never tall. As a man, he was never that tall. But he was super, super fit. He was really strong. And if you look at pictures of him, you'll see that. He's quite short, but he's very stocky. He's got a lot of muscle. Now, family of 9, so the mum, the dad, and the 7 kids, they live in a tiny little apartment in Wisconsin. And despite all of the scrimping and the saving, the family were facing real poverty. It was rough times for the Weisses. And so they had to make a difficult decision. And it was this, that the dad would have to move somewhere else to find a job to be able to pay for his family. And that place that he went to was New York. And he took Eric with him. Now, this was devastating for Eric because he didn't want to be parted from his mum. He was very, very, very close to his mum. But anyway, the family have to try and make some kind of money, so this is what happens. The dad takes Eric to New York. They live for a short time in a boarding house. The dad does various jobs, he gathers up enough money, and when he has enough money, he sends for his wife, his remaining children, and they all reunite as a family in New York. And they live in, they live in poverty again, but they've just got slightly more money than they had when they lived in Wisconsin. So it meant that everyone in the family had to get a job. All the kids had to try and bring in some kind of income. Now, Eric had a job about age 13, and it was delivering fruit round the local neighbourhood, but it didn't bring in much money. Now, it was around about age 13 that his first of many, many, many titles would happen. Eric Weiss would have a lot of titles in his life, and a lot of them self-imposed. He called himself, at age 13, the Prince of the Air. And he called himself this because he was brilliant at the trapeze. So he would take a rope, he would basically tie it between like two huge big tall trees. He would climb up the trees, tie up the rope, and then he would amaze people with the fact that he could walk across this rope and not fall off. Now, this was without any training, any work with anyone. He just had this skill. He just knew how to do it. But he also knew this, and this is very, very telling of what he's going to become in his life. He also knew that at age 13, this was a skill. He had something that people wanted to see, and so he turned that into money. He knew he could make money for his family. So what he would do is he would charge small amounts, and he would do things like tie a rope on buildings in New York. And he kept pushing it. It was higher and higher and more dangerous each time. But people paid to come and watch this teenage boy do this, because it just seemed like, what is he doing? Like, this is incredible. He's not in a circus environment. He's not in anywhere like that. He's just literally on the streets doing this. And so that was how he brought money into the family home. So he's doing all of this gymnastic-y sort of trapeze work, and he starts to develop a fascination. Well, is that a fascination? I think it's more of an obsession with magic and the great magicians of the past, the elders of magic who'd gone before him. He would study books which described magicians' tricks. He would practice card tricks, coin tricks, rope tricks, rabbits out of hats. I don't know if he did that one, but I'm imagining he probably did something like that. All day long, he practiced these tricks. Now, he wasn't alone in this. His younger brother, Theodore, was also an aspiring magician. And so the two of them, they learned tricks together in the house. They would practice with each other as they grew up. Eric was really confident in front of people. You know, as I just said, he had no bother gathering crowds to watch him do the trapeze. So all these tricks he's learning with his brother in the house, he will happily just put them in front of an audience of 100 people. Come and see this young, great teenage magician. This is kind of where my interest in him begins. This showmanship, this side of him, that's what I think is really interesting. Because he kind of rewrote the rule. Well, hang on. I was going to say he rewrote the rules for magicians and performers, but I don't know if he actually rewrote them or he just wrote them. Actually, now I think about it, he kind of created magic, and he would go on to do things people hadn't done before. They were huge, different things, as you'll see in his story. So yeah, I think that's what's so fascinating about him, is this showmanship and this idea that he reinvents himself a lot. He's very, very good at reinventing himself. Now, he doesn't always get it right. And we're going to see that in his story. There's moments where he gets it very, very wrong. But when he does get it right, it is amazing. So back to his teenage years, and by now he's about 17, 18, and as I said, very athletic. And while magic has been great for bringing in money into the house, that's all been brilliant, he's starting to actually think, what is he going to do for a job? What's his real job going to be? Because maybe there's not going to be a long-term future in magic. So he needs to get serious about a career. He begins to train as a runner with a man called Joseph Rinn. Joseph Rinn runs an athletics club in New York. And he's super impressed with the young Eric Weiss, because Eric's had no sort of real training. He's done some running at school. He does some in his life, but he actually has a real skill for it. So he starts to train Eric daily. And they set their sights on the Olympics. Because he's way beyond the average. He's way beyond your average runner, Eric. And so Joseph Rinn thinks, this young guy could be my protege. He could actually make it all the way to becoming a top athlete in America. He could really represent us at the Olympics. Now there's something interesting about Joseph Rinn that plays a really big part in the development of who Eric will become. Joseph Rinn, as well as a trainer of athletes, was also a magician. He was a very good magician who had some very strong opinions about how magic was carried out, who should be allowed to practice magic, but most of all, Joseph Rinn had some very strong opinions about anything paranormal. Anything involving mediums or psychics. Joseph Rinn hated all of that. He would form an entire society around debunking mediums and people who practiced the paranormal. Now that's quite extreme. I'm not really sure if I entirely believe in mediums, but hey, I'm not running around making societies out of it. Anyway, Joseph Rinn, the athletic trainer / magician, made this his life's work. Now I say that's interesting because we're not there yet in Eric's story, but this is something that's going to become very important later on. So for right now, here he is trying out for the Olympics, and it wasn't just in running, although that was his main sort of speciality, I guess. Eric was also training in gymnastics and boxing. So, when it came time to try out for the USA Olympic team, he wasn't successful. Well, he wasn't successful in the running part of it, but he was successful in being taken on the boxing part of it. So, this is great. This is great for Eric. He's going to be a boxer at the Olympics. Fantastic. He's training hard. He's working really hard. And then he gets hit by the flu. And then he's down for 6 weeks. Now, in that 6 weeks, he falls way behind. He loses the strength, the stamina, all of that stuff he had built up. And he's dropped from the team altogether. And that is the end of his athletic dreams. Now here's the interesting thing. An a good point to pause, because everything that I've just told you may well be a lie. It gets debated. While it's certainly true that he did train as an athlete, the whole story about whether or not he ever actually tried for the Olympics and got onto the Olympic team for boxing, that's up for debate. He will say that is absolute fact. That happened. People with a lot of time in their hands have done a lot of maths, they've done a lot of working it out, and what they've realised is that in the years that he's saying he was trying out for the Olympics team, the actual first Olympic Games was 6 years away. It hadn't even happened yet. So how the hell was he trying out for something that hadn't yet begun? But I tell you why I've included this. Because this is where we get to a massive part of what he is all about. Showmanship. Tall tales. A lot of his life will be debated. And he'll go on to do some amazing things. But he's also the absolute king of PR. He knew how to sell himself. He knew how to tell a convincing tale. So like I say, he may at one point have almost been an Olympian. He might not. Whatever the truth is, that all comes to an end. Now the thing that never leaves him is this passion for magic. So, like many others at the time, if you've got a burning desire to do magic, where are you going to go? Vaudeville. Vaudeville. That's where you're going to go. That's the place to be if you're an entertainer. I would have killed it as a vaudeville singer. No, I wouldn't really. I wonder if they had storytelling. Come and see the great Barry Henderson. He's going to tell you a story. No, probably not. It was all like, what was vaudeville? It was all like, well, it was tricks and magic and all that, wasn't it? Yeah, all that business. People singing, people dancing, twins, all that stuff. I don't know what twins means, but you know what I'm saying. So, on the vaudeville scene, his act is mainly card tricks. He calls himself the King of Cards. Here we go, yet another title in his life. And he's pretty sharp with those card tricks. Is this your card? Madam, I believe it was the 9 of diamonds. You know, all that business. Now, this is fine for a while, right? This is okay. But it's not really bringing in a great deal of money, or in fact fame. Because here's the thing, everybody's doing card tricks. Every act is doing the same kind of things, and it's like, well, boring. We're seeing the same thing over and over again. And he's not on his own. He's got his brother Theodore, who, but for some unknown reason, goes by the nickname Dash. So Dash and Eric would perform as the brothers Houdini. Because you see, Eric Weiss at this point had decided, I need a name change. He didn't like Eric, so he changed it to Harry. He didn't like Weiss, so he changed it to Houdini. Now this was because he had read a book by some old French magician who had an I at the end of his name, and for some reason Harry thought that this made you sound exotic if you just put an I at the end of his name. So that's why he went for Houdini and not Houdin or Hunden or something along those lines. So I mean, I could do it and I could be the great Barry Henderson. Great, try it with your own name. Try it right now. Add an I to the end of your surname. See how fabulous you sound with that. So, there's loads of other acts, right? There's lots of great vaudeville acts, and there's one called the Floral Sisters. They sound fabulous. And the Floral Sisters, whose act I can only imagine includes some sort of flower arranging, one of those sisters is Wilhelmina Beatrice Ranner, who, thank goodness, goes by the name Bess, because I'm not spending the rest of this episode saying Wilhelmina Beatrice Ranner. That's just ridiculous. So Bess, who's she? Well, she's this lively, energetic, very attractive young performer, and the Houdini brothers both like her very much. Especially Dash Houdini. And soon they begin to date. They date for a couple of months, and then, scandal of scandals, Harry and Bess begin an affair behind his brother's back. Oh, come on now, Harry. Come on now. That's not gentlemanly at all, is it? However, Dash Houdini is such a nice guy. He actually steps aside and lets his older brother date Bess. And more than this, Bess becomes a part of their act, which is like weird. Anyway, she becomes the sort of Debbie McGee to his Paul Daniels, if you will. Now, American listeners, Australian listeners, if you don't know who Debbie McGee is, for goodness sakes, go and look it up. I mean, she should be a UK national treasure. She's a fabulous magician's assistant. So, Harry, Dash, Bess, they're at a point where, like I said, vaudeville's fine, everyone's doing card tricks. Harry has an idea. He's going to take a leap, and it's a big leap. He's going to try escapology, the art of escape. Now, as we know, this is of course going to become his calling card, the thing he's famed for. But since a young age, he had this knack for unpicking locks. Something in his brain meant that he was able to look at any lock and just work out the mechanics of it. I mean, it's a weird but amazing skill. So, he's looking around vaudeville and he says to Bess and to Dash, look, I am bored of the mundane, I'm bored of the boring. Let's give the public a real thrill. So this is what he sets out to do. Now, it's pretty basic to begin with. He'll come on stage, the audience see him get into a pair of handcuffs, he then disappears behind a screen, usually a sheet of some sort, whilst Bess and Dash whip the crowd up into a frenzy. Is he going to get free? Is he not? Ooh, the drama. And then the screen drops, and of course, he's no longer in the handcuffs. Very good. I love this information that I found out. Often, the trick would last maybe half an hour, and for 25 minutes of that half an hour, whilst Bess and Dash are doing their best to whip that crowd up, Harry would be sitting behind the screen reading a newspaper. I love that. He's just like, la la la, doing the crossword. As the crowd are like, oh my god, he's never going to get out the handcuffs. He's like, yeah. I got out of them in about 30 seconds. Now, it was then Dash who said to him, you've got to add more risk. The public have really got to believe you are never going to get out of these handcuffs. So then time was added as a factor to his act. You know, it was the great Houdini. Can he escape within 5 minutes? And then like a huge clock would go up and the crowd would like count down, and like it would send crowds into such a frenzy. They would go nuts because they would count the minutes out loud, screaming, "He's never going to get out of the handcuffs." And then, just in the nick of time, he always got out of them. And repeat, and repeat. And this act just became so big. The drama of the act, the now, oh my God, he can escape from anything, was bringing in pretty large crowds. And life is going pretty well. Harry and Bess decide that they are going to get married. Their love story is a really nice one. They were, even though, she had started out with a brother, that was just a false start. They're really, really deeply in love, and they would stay deeply in love for the rest of their lives. People would say of Harry and Bess, they just got each other. Like they just understood each other all the time. Harry would write Bess a love letter every day of their life together. Sometimes, even when she sat in the same room, he would write her a love letter. That's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing when you think that these days people are like, I can't even be bothered to send my partner a text message, or, oh my God, actually, I can't even be arsed to send an Instagram message. There's Harry Houdini penning a love letter to her every day. I mean, slightly weird that she would be sitting in the corner of the room and he's like, Bess, my darling. Anyway, that's their thing. Let them get on with it. So Harry, of course, is building a brilliant reputation. Newspapers are calling him the little man who can escape anything. Yet another title. So he performed for thousands of people, breaking out of chains, handcuffs, ropes. He got out of them all. Now, he performed a lot of his tricks absolutely stark, bollock naked. And this was just to show that he wasn't hiding any keys or knives or up to any kind of trickery. Because of course, here's the thing. When he gets really successful, you're going to get your skeptics. People are going to go, it's all tricks. He's got a knife. That's how he's getting out of handcuffs. So he was like, do you know what? If you don't believe me, I'm taking all my clothes off. I'm going to stand here with my willy out, and I will show you I am not hiding anything. Now, also inevitably, he gets famous. Copycats come along. Everyone wants to be the next Houdini. And look, I know how that feels, okay? Having the most successful podcast that's ever existed, of course, I've got copycats out there. I am kidding. But really, these were just pretenders to the throne. They weren't real threats to Harry because Harry had this amazing ability to always take it way further than people could imagine. That's what I think his skill was. And when he started seeing all of these pretenders arriving, he was like, I am going to have to pimp my act like Jay-Z pimped early Beyonce. He is going to have to really take the spectacle level up and get much more daring. And that's what he was so good at. A poster begins appearing in major cities all around the world, and it says, Challenge Houdini. Now these cities, London, New York, Chicago, Paris, Germany, Russia, they would invite Harry to come to their city, perform his escape tricks, mainly the handcuff ones, to crowds of thousands of people. So he would go to these cities, and as part of the challenge, the mayor or the senior member of the city would say, okay, we've got a pair of handcuffs made by our finest locksmith. They are cast iron. You will never escape. And of course, each time he did. But he had to make a bit of a deal of it. He had to look like it was a bit of a struggle. But the truth of it, not a big deal at all. One pair of handcuffs was as easy as the next for him. It was during this part of his career that tragedy struck and he lost his mother. Now, Harry had always been close with his mum. Even when he was miles away on the other side of the world, he would write letters to her. One of his most prized possessions in life was a photo of his mum and Bess together, and he titled it "My Two Favourite Ladies." Now, he didn't get much time to grieve, unfortunately, because he is on the verge of becoming, at this point, the most famous magician of all time. In fact, he'd approached the American Magical Society. Yes, that is a real thing. And he'd asked them if he could become the president. And they allowed him. They said, yeah, of course. You're Harry Houdini. Why would we say no? Harry had some ideas about what he was seeing in the magic scene and some thoughts about what he saw supposed magicians doing. And he wanted to challenge it. Now, that'll come a little later in his story. For now, let's look at some of his most famous tricks. In 1904, Harry would go through his most difficult, if not the most difficult, trick of his life, and it happened in London. So, we have the Daily Mirror newspaper, and it offers this challenge, as so many were doing, to Harry to come to London, try his famous escape trick with a pair of handcuffs that this newspaper was claiming had taken 3 years to make and were unbreakable. Harry obliges. So he gets to London, and there's 5,000 people turning up to see him in the biggest theatre venue. As well as a crowd, there's also police, a judge, 100 journalists. Obviously there was no crime going on in London that day. They all just took the day off. So Harry appears on stage. He's wearing a suit and a jacket. By now he'd graduated from performing naked because he felt like, well, people believe now that I'm not up to any trickery. So here he is, he's in his suit and his jacket. He tells the crowd, I'll be free of these handcuffs in minutes. And he disappears behind the screen. Now, this newspaper has made such a big deal about how much these handcuffs cannot be broken. So the crowd are going mental. And standing in the wings, watching really closely, there's police, there's journalists, just to make sure that there's no monkey business, that there's no one else involved in the act. Obviously, Bess is also in the wings. After half an hour, Harry appears and he asks if the handcuffs could be removed for a moment so that he can take his coat off. And the daily newspaper says, no, that's not the deal. So he says, fine, okay? This is what he does next. He buries his head into his coat, moves his face down towards the pocket, and he pulls out from his coat pocket a small knife. He then, for the next 15 minutes on stage, cuts himself out of the jacket he's wearing using just the knife in his mouth. And of course the crowd are like, this is amazing. Look at this man. Look at what he's doing. Once the coat has been cut off, he disappears. Just to be sure, that the knife cannot get used to open these handcuffs, a police officer comes on stage, takes the knife, shows it to the crowd, and says, the knife is gone. There's nothing that he can be using, to get these handcuffs open. So another 20 minutes passes, and he's not reappearing free of the handcuffs. He comes back round from the other side of the screen and he says, I need a drink of water. So Bess, his lovely wife, enters the stage. She gives him a drink of water. She holds it up to his mouth. He drinks the whole big glass of water. And when he's finished the water, she gives him a big kiss on the mouth and she leaves the stage. The crowd are clapping. Oh, his lovely wife, lovely, lovely. He goes back behind the screen. The crowd wait. Now he's struggling. That's the truth. These handcuffs are the hardest thing he's ever had to break out of. And here he is in this huge public arena. He's been set this challenge that he's said he can absolutely smash, and he's starting to struggle. And the crowd are really whipped up because they're starting to think we could be about to see the great Houdini fail. After another hour passes, Harry emerges free of the handcuffs, and the crowd goes bananas. So he's lifted onto the shoulders of the crowd, he's paraded through the streets of London, people are shaking, want to shake his hand. Oh my God, he's amazing. The entire time that's happening, he's just crying because he's so shaken. He's never had a struggle like that when he's been trying to get out of something. He's never been that trapped before. Then come the conspiracy theories. Why did it take so long for Harry to get out of those handcuffs? What happened there? What went wrong? The first theory that emerges is the entire thing was an act. The struggle. There was no struggle. He knew exactly how to get out of them. He could have done it in seconds, but the whole I need out of my coat, that was all an act. Then the second theory is that actually no, he was trapped in those handcuffs, and when he asked for the water and Bess gave him a lovely big kiss, she actually had the key in her mouth and slipped him the key. A journalist will try to say that Bess was backstage begging someone for the key because she knew her husband was in trouble. Harry and Bess will say, nonsense. Or was it all just a part of the showmanship? Was it all just a part of what Harry Houdini does? Well, whatever it was, it propelled him into the biggest tricks that he would ever do. He'd go on to be buried alive 3 times with a straitjacket on and manage to free himself. He would be put in handcuffs, placed inside a metal container, which was locked from the outside and then dropped into the Hudson River, only to emerge 20 minutes later completely unharmed. He would be lowered into a Chinese water torture chamber, tied with chains and ropes, and get himself out of it. By now, Houdini is the best in the business. He is the business, in fact. He begins making some serious cash, and he can now afford to buy a house for him and Bess in New York. Interestingly, a lot of the money that he gets comes from a court case in which he sues a man who claims that he once gave Harry a key during one of his famous escapes. I can't remember which one it was, but he basically, says, oh, that particular escape, yeah, I was there and I gave him a key. And Harry loses his mind. He's like, nobody gave me a key, and nobody will besmirch my name. Sorry to use a Shakespearean term, but nobody will besmirch my name. So he takes this man to court and he sues him, and he gets a huge figure in damages. Again, it's interesting because, I suppose now we live in this world of, we're used to seeing celebrities and famous people take the newspapers to courts all the time for trying to defame them. In fact, it happens so often it's just white noise. But it wasn't when Harry Houdini did it, because he was the greatest showman on earth, and here was somebody trying to discredit him, and he very quickly put an end to that malarkey. So, as I said, Harry was really concerned with what he saw happening in the magic world. And the main thing that he had a problem with was the bad name that magic was getting by so-called mediums, spiritualists who believed they could communicate with the dead. To say that Harry Houdini had problems with mediums is the understatement of the year. That would be like saying Madonna had had some moderate success. He was livid, furious with what he saw in vaudeville and in theatres and newspapers. People claiming to communicate with the dead became Harry Houdini's obsession. As he saw it, these people were going to bring the good name of magic to its knees, and he wouldn't allow it. So he set out on a mission to prove that it's all fake.
There is nothing supernatural.
I think it's so interesting to this is again why I'm so into Harry Houdini's story. Here is a man who's famous for basically trickery and illusion, is now hell-bent on stopping people who are becoming famous and making money out of trickery and illusion. But I do also get where he's coming from. He's saying, look, these people are fake and they're charging innocent people. They're taking advantage of people who are grieving. And I won't have it. But what if they weren't? What if they weren't all fake?
You knew my husband a long time.
Oh, yes, madame.
And you remember what he always said about these things?
That it was impossible for the dead to return.
This proves he was right. For if it would have been possible, I would have had some sign from him in the past 10 years.
Helen Duncan was born in Perth, Scotland, not too far from me, and it was 1897. As a child, Helen was a curious child. She seemed to have a knack for knowing things before she learned it. At school, she seemed to know the answers to every question before anyone else, and she could only explain it as, I was given the answer. It sort of dropped into my brain. Now, as a young child, she could often predict the death of locals long before it actually happened. Strange. As a teenager, she would say she was never alone. She was always surrounded by a series of different presences. So in Scotland, she began to get a bit of a name for herself. This kind of incredible knowledge of she could see things around her that others couldn't see. She started to claim that the dead would visit her and give her messages to pass on. Sometimes these messages would be like a dead soldier appearing to Helen to pass on to the wife that he was dead and she should remarry. Sometimes it was mothers, fathers who would visit Helen so that she could go to their children and pass on messages. Now, there was a healthy amount of scepticism about what Helen did, but then some other people couldn't fault her for how accurate she was. So in about the early 1900s, the word spread that a very gifted and authentic medium was living in Scotland, and Helen was invited to London to perform her act. Now, here's the thing, here's the problem. Helen didn't really have an act. She was just a woman who could communicate with the dead. That was her skill, and she was by no means a performer. Well, she was about to become one, whether she liked it or not. Helen had wandered into this territory that she had no idea would eventually kill her. During one of her earliest shows, Helen asked if there was anyone in the audience who had a son who was a soldier and had recently left to travel overseas. She described the young boy in great detail, and a woman in the crowd said, "That's my son you're describing." Helen went very quiet and said to the woman, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but the ship he was sailing on has sunk, and he has passed to the other side." Now, that might sound like a bit of trickery. A soldier, a description of how someone might look. These are things that skeptics would say, yeah, but you could just, you could pull all these sorts of things up and make something up. But here is the difference. That ship that had sunk, that had actually happened, and nobody knew that had occurred, except for the British Intelligence Office. They were the only people. Nobody in the public was that information, so there's no chance that Helen could have known that. She did her act, and 2 days later it was published in the newspapers that ship had sunk. So of course, two things were sparked. One, the great belief that Helen was in fact real. She was the greatest living medium. And two, major suspicion from the British government. They decided in that moment Helen Duncan was a spy. Helen, of course, is like, that is ridiculous. I'm not a spy. I'm just someone who speaks with the dead. So, over the next few years, she continues to communicate with the dead, and in that time, thousands upon thousands will claim that Helen Duncan put them back in contact with their dead relatives. Dead wives, husbands, mothers, fathers, the whole lot. Now, she then is sort of forced to take this into a stage show. Helen's not really very comfortable with this. She would rather do this in the comfort of her living room than have to go out on stage night after night and do this in front of crowds. But, there's money to be made, there's pressure, so she does it. Now, when she's on stage, Helen is not alone. It might appear she's alone, but no. She has two spirit helpers. These are two spirit guides who appear, and they help her connect with the dead. So the first is Albert. Albert appears to Helen, and of course only she can see him. Albert is an old man who is sometimes Australian and sometimes posh English. Albert sounds like a riot. Now, that's not the only spirit that Helen has. Sometimes there's Peggy. Peggy is a child who likes to sing Baba Black Sheep. I would love to have been at one of her shows. Can you imagine it? Albert giving it, sometimes I'm an Australian and then sometimes I'm very posh English. While the child Peggy's giving it, Baba black sheep, have you any wool? I mean, what a fucking riot that show would have been. So, pretty soon, Helen is selling out theatres all across the world with Albert and Peggy at her side. And this catches the attention of a man called Harry Wilson. Now, he is an investigator of the paranormal. And he comes from the standpoint of, I don't believe a single word of this Helen Duncan act. So I want to investigate it. So he goes to Helen and he says, basically to her face, I don't believe you. I think this is all lies. Can I investigate you? And she says, yeah, absolutely. Come to my next show and you'll see me speak with the dead. So he does. He gets to her show. He brings a camera. And he sees Helen do her act and he sees her connecting with dead relatives of people. And he can't argue with that bit of it. But then he also sees Helen do something on stage that makes him suspicious. She produces ectoplasm from her mouth. Like a substance comes up from out of her body onto the stage. And she says this is because she's being possessed by spirits. Now this investigator, he is suspicious. He takes this substance and he has it tested. It turns out that this otherworldly ectoplasm is in fact just regurgitated food. Sometimes it's regurgitated toilet paper. Sometimes it's cheese. That is disgusting. His photographs, when he gets them developed, show that where the audience thought that they could see spirits on the stage moving behind Helen, it was in fact a series of blankets, dummies, and she had very cleverly positioned them to be lit in a way on stage that made them look like spirits. So of course, this is huge and it exposes her as a fraud. As Olivia Newton-John said to John Travolta in Grease, you're a fake, you're a phony, and I wish I'd never laid eyes on you. But opinion is divided. There's those who claim that Helen absolutely put them in contact with someone dead in their family. And then there's other people who are like faker, faker, faker. So, tricky. Helen will say, look, yeah, okay, the ectoplasm bit of it, right, okay, I did fake that. Okay, the dummies on stage, yeah, alright, that was all part of the act. But I can actually communicate with the dead. Can she? The British government are still watching her. Now, she correctly predicts that another warship will sink. And when she gets it right, Helen is arrested. This is under the Witchcraft Act, and she's sentenced to a period of time in prison. And during this time, she becomes so depressed, so broken in prison that her health begins to fall apart. She becomes really ill. It's too much pressure now for Helen. What started as her being able to do her thing in her living room has now become the subject of headlines in the newspaper, and she never saw that coming. In fact, Winston Churchill gets involved at one point and says she is nothing but obscure tomfoolery. Do not pay attention to this woman. Helen says, I didn't do anything wrong. Okay, I faked a bit of stage stuff. That's just theatrics. The actual thing I do is real. Files upon files are created about Helen. She's treated with suspicion even after she's released from prison. The police are still watching her, convinced that she's caught up in some sort of spying. She's ordered to stop holding seances. No more Albert. G'day, mates. No more Peggy singing Ba Ba Black Sheep. But she doesn't stop. Helen doesn't stop. She carries on predicting correctly people's deaths and claiming to be visited by spirits. Her health never recovers after her stint in prison, and in 1956 she dies quietly at home in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now the legacy, the mystery around her is still written about. Those files that were written about Helen Duncan cannot be opened until the year 2046. That's another 24 years before we will be allowed to see what the police had on her or what they had written about her. Now, her grandchildren are fighting to get the police records opened, and you can see why. They're saying, look, she's been dead for 60 years. Why can't the files be opened? But the law is the law. So Helen Duncan, the Helen Duncans of the world, they were exactly who Harry Houdini was trying to stop. So him and Bess, they decide that they're going to retire the huge big spectacle acts for a while. Harry's going to stop doing his big theatrics and they're going to really focus on these fraud mediums. This is what they did. I love this. They would get dressed up in disguises and they would travel to small American cities. They would go to the local graveyard and they would look for the most recent gravestone. And then they would write down the names, the family names, the dates of death, anything they could find out. All of this in disguise. They would then go to the local cafes, the bars of the city, and they would gather up as much information as they could about the locals, always writing down names and details. Now when they had enough, they would put up a poster advertising a seance at the local city hall or wherever, the big public place. And of course the crowds would gather. No idea these crowds that they were watching Harry and Bess Houdini. The crowds would be amazed when these two exotic mediums would claim to know lots of small details about locals in the city. They could name the recently dead and all their family members. They had the crowd eating out of their hand, and it's at that point they would tear off the disguises and say, "You've been tricked. It's us. It's the Houdinis. We did this very carefully. We tricked you. We knew exactly what we were doing. And we're here to prove talking to the dead does not exist." They took this even further by, again, putting on their disguises, sneaking into really popular spiritualist shows, medium shows, in great big venues, waiting until it got really tense in the theatre and then jumping up mid-show and shouting, "Fake! It's all fake! Don't believe any of it!" And then they would be escorted out of the theatre for causing a ruckus. Imagine what an actual nightmare. If you're a medium, right, you're a spiritualist and you're up there and there's crowds of thousands and then bloody Harry Houdini and his wife jump up and start shouting you're a faker. Oh my god. Just to be clear, Harry Houdini did believe in communication with the dead. Contrary to how it might sound, he absolutely did. In fact, what he wanted was he wanted for his own life this to be his greatest trick. He wanted, when he died, to be able to communicate with Bess from the beyond. It was the spectacle he hated. It was the Helen Duncans faking it with dummies and fake ectoplasm. That's what he had a problem with. He saw it as really cheap entertainment, and what he did was the real craft of magic. Harry was going to go to as many lengths as he possibly could to prove his point, and he wasn't above losing fans, losing friends. In fact, he was really good friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of Sherlock Holmes. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle was big into all of that world of paranormal. He was a big believer. And Harry and him, they were good friends. And one night, Harry and Bess were round at Arthur Conan Doyle's house for dinner. Arthur Conan Doyle's wife was there. And Harry was talking about this, about how much he believed in people who really had the genuine gift of doing it, but that he was so sick of these people making money out of it who were fakers. At which point, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle says, well, my wife actually happens to be able to communicate with the dead. Now, of course, the wife's there. She's sitting at the dinner table, and Harry becomes very interested. So he says to Arthur Conan Doyle's wife, okay, that's amazing. Could you communicate with my dead mother? And the wife says, okay. Get me a piece of paper and a pen, because when the spirits come to me, they talk to me and I write down what the spirits say. So she gets a piece of paper. Harry's hovering about over her shoulder. She goes into a sort of trance, and then moments later she says, she's here. Your mother, Harry, is speaking to me from beyond. She then begins to write on the piece of paper a big, long letter to Harry from his dead mother. The seance ends. She hands the piece of paper to Harry Houdini. He looks at it and he says, you're a fake. That's not true. My mother did not just visit you, and you are not writing these words from what she told you. This is written in English. My mother only spoke Hungarian. She never spoke a word of English in her life. At that, him and Bess get up from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's house. They leave and they never speak again. In their own life, in their private life, when it was just the two of them, Harry and Bess dabbled a lot in the attempt to reach the spirits. They would try to have their own seances, but they never had any luck. Over the next few years, Harry continues to work with the American Magical Society, and by now the world is full now of pretend Houdinis. They've popped up all over the place. People are doing escape acts all the time. He still performed every now and then, and he and Bess, they just carried on living their life in New York. But there was an unrest around Harry. Many in the magic world really did think of him as a troublemaker, a problematic sort who wanted to ban every form of entertainment and keep it all about the craft of magic. It's not actually the truth. He didn't mind the entertainment side of it. He just didn't want the fakers. That was the thing. He would go as far as courtrooms. He wanted laws changed that prevented people from pretending that they could reach spirits and charge money for it. Those laws never got changed at the time. I don't know if they've ever been changed. But he was, really, really against it. Anyway, he'd caused enough of a stir that he was becoming incredibly annoying to what was a very, very lucrative industry. Now, obviously these days, right, we have what's his name? Oh my god, his name's going right out of my head. David Blaine. You have your David Blaines of the world. You have your Paul Daniels of the world. You have all these magicians, right, who do amazing daredevil tricks and mind-blowing stunts. But remember that at this time, Harry Houdini, in terms of people who genuinely put themselves in danger, was kind of the one and only. These people now can do all sorts of things, and that's amazing, but no one had really seen someone plunged into icy water in a straitjacket before. He was invincible. He really was. So in 1926, he's performing in a hotel in Michigan, and a plucky young magician student comes to see him to meet the great Houdini backstage. And they chat. This student, not able to absolutely believe that Houdini is standing in front of him, says to him, "If you are this indestructible man, as we've all been led to believe, can I punch you in the stomach and see just how tough you are?" So Harry agrees to this. The student punches Harry hard in the stomach. The student walks away, happy with himself. He got a chance to really punch Harry Houdini. 2 days later, at age 53, Harry Houdini dies from internal bleeding. That punch had ruptured his appendix, and in searing pain, he went on stage that night to try and perform a handcuff escape. He collapsed and he was rushed to the hospital. And so the great man himself was gone. Quickly, rumours started that it was no accident. People in the magic community knew Harry had been suffering from stomach issues for months and he wouldn't see a doctor. And then this student mysteriously appears and punches him. Weird. Was the spiritual community finally fed up of their biggest critic? Or was it just a genuine accident? Before his death, him and Bess had cooked up a plan. And the plan was this: if he was to die before her, every Halloween she would hold a séance to try and contact him. That way he could perform the trick that he really wanted to, and that was to come back from the dead. For 10 years after his death, every single Halloween, Bess followed his instructions. However, she never made contact.
You knew my husband a long time.
Oh, yes, madame.
And you remember what he always said about these things?
That it was impossible for the dead to return.
This proves he was right. For if it would have been possible, I would have had some sign from him in the past 10 years.
During that time, Houdini museums began to pop up all over the world. I visited the one in Hungary, actually, at the home that he was born in. Yeah, it's great. But they were all over. Some in America, some Germany, Russia, everywhere had a Houdini museum. They all wanted a bit of the handcuffs, a bit of a straitjacket. There's just all of his belongings were sent all over the world, housed in lots of different places. But the one thing people still wanted was Harry Houdini to return as a spirit. So Bess remarried. She married a man named Ed. And in 1943, sadly, she suffered a heart attack on board a train to New York, and she died. Now, before she died, she had asked a member of the Magic Circle to continue seances every Halloween if anything should happen to her, just in case Harry came back. These seances continue now. They are very exclusive affairs. Every Halloween, in a magical mansion in the Hollywood Hills, the top magicians in the world gather and attempt to contact Harry. So far, 90 years after his death, no contact has been made. But they continue every year. In fact, it's written into the sacred magical documents, whatever they are, that one day, some lucky magician will make contact with Houdini. In amongst Houdini's belongings found after his death was a letter that he had written to his mother many years before, just at the height of his handcuff fame. And I think what he's written to his mother here sums him up entirely. He's talking specifically about the police, and he says, "I dared to challenge them. I made myself invincible. That is my success." And so ends the story. Alright then. I hope you enjoyed that. Jason Abercrombie, long-time listener to the podcast. I believe you asked me to do the story of Harry Houdini about 400 years ago. So, finally, it's here. And I think that's the great lesson we should all take. Ask and ye shall receive. You may have to wait 4 years, but if you've ever sent me a story and you thought, well, do you know what? Barry's never going to tell that story. Just wait. 20 years' time, you might get that tale. Who knows? Anyway, right, I'm out of here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'm sure you'll be in touch. Thank you so much for everyone who has gotten in touch. Genuinely, I mean this seriously. I'm not pissing about here. I do really appreciate people getting in touch over the past wee while to check that I'm okay. I am. Alright, I'm out of here. See you all later. Bye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on. Let's do it. Let's get it over.